Hey guys, welcome into another show. My name is Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the college fantasy football site. Lot to get to this week, week 11. We've come up towards the end of the season now. A lot of guys either in the playoffs, maybe playing for a higher seed if you play in a maybe a 14 playoff. Those may begin in week 12. Some guys planning ahead have a week 1 bye in the playoffs. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then some guys just kind of finishing out the season. Been a rough year trying to keep with the integrity of the league, keep up with the integrity of the league, and close out on a high note. A lot of you guys in keeper leagues, so still very important to keep up with some of the notes and the observations that I'll be pushing out over the next couple of weeks. You know, as we get into the playoff weeks with the notes and observations, particularly this time of the year, and when I look at some notes and observations that I have in years past, they will start to condense a little bit. I'll start kind of picking out some tidbits that I think may be worthy for some of you guys moving forward in leagues throughout the playoffs. I don't necessarily expect them to be as in detail, maybe in depth, or to identify as many trends as I have throughout the year, just because it's the playoffs. I mean, there aren't a lot of guys at this particular time of the year that have a player from San Jose State on their roster or looking to pick up that 1 week sleeper. At this particular time, this may be one of the very last weeks where guys kind of go in and maybe look for those 1-2 hidden gems throughout the week. It gets really tough to drop guys as the playoffs start. Your roster, there's a reason you're in the playoffs, many of you, and your rosters are really just rock solid. And so it gets harder and harder to drop guys. And this is where your depth comes into play over the next couple of weeks. So a lot to get to tonight. The first thing that I want to do is just sort of mention the in-house college fantasy football site Total Points League, where right now Trojans, who has led for about 9 of 10 weeks this year, sits on top of the live standings right now. I myself am in second, and Fighting Gamecock is in third. We're been kind of it's been a 3-man battle here at the top now for a few weeks. We've got some guys like Swarm 18, Fear the Ear, Red Raider, filling out the top 6. Team Razor Eaters at 7, Rebel Nut at 8, and Jesta to Trife at 9, Team Basketballin' at 10. I think you've got to go down to Takeo Spike Jew, UB Bull, Style and Profile, and Son of a Gun down to 13, where they're about 200 points back, and I think realistically they have to make a move this week with 2 weeks remaining after this weekend. But like I mentioned on the show last week, we're going to go ahead and get some prizes together for you guys. Originally it was going to be the top 3. Looks like I'm going to expand that to top 5, and we'll figure it out whether it's with some t-shirts, some 2019 content, and then also in regards to future content. There's something up on the site. You may have seen it. The 2018-19 Bowl Fantasy Preview Guide is that's going to come out. Something we've been putting together now for 4 years. We just have a lot of fun with it. We look at a lot of the bowls. We rank all of the players. We kind of give you the confidence picks. So it's just something really fun to have during the bowl season to check out, particularly if you guys like to kind of bet a little bit during the bowl season, if you guys like to play some of those confidence pools that I know ESPN does and a few different sites. So check that out. We put a copy of last year's on the site just so you guys can get an idea of what it looks like. And, some leagues, and not many, there are some leagues that continue throughout the bowl season as part of their college fantasy football league. And then last year, as part of the CFF site, I got together, I think it was 8 in-house leagues, college fantasy football bowl leagues, where, there were leagues of 8 teams, and everybody drafted about 40 players between quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, defense, special teams. One player, it wasn't multiple players on different teams. So that in the league, 8 different teams, everybody's got different players. It makes all the bowl games that much more interesting. And I think a lot of you guys that played last year are looking to return, and so we may have to create some additional leagues for some of you new guys as well. But be on the lookout for some announcements on that. Be in tune with the website for that, and I'll probably, more than likely, shoot out some emails as well, because some of those spots were on a first come, first serve basis. So if you're interested in some of the college bowl leagues, the best thing for you to do is hit me up on that exclusive email. I'll go ahead and bookmark your email and try to make sure that I reserve you a spot in those college fantasy football bowl leagues. So, one thing I did last week is I posted the start bench up on the site ahead of time. I didn't do that this week. What I decided to do was sort of hold on to that content, and as we get to the games, I'll mention the guys that are on the start bench list when we get to their names, and then that way I'll be knocking out two birds with one stone. The one request that I did have coming in this week that I'm going to try to address really quick is just sort of philosophy in regards to bye weeks in the playoffs. There are a lot of you guys out there that are sitting on byes, looking for some matchups in week 12 and 13, which is the way to do it. If you have a bye this week, you need to have your radar up. You probably should have done it already, but you need to be looking at guys in week 12, week 13. And, once when the games start this weekend, the best thing to do, and here's something that I like to do as well. There's usually, in our league, there's a 24-hour waiver period. So you can drop a guy and then it takes 24 hours for waivers to process. If you're now sitting with a week 1 bye in the playoffs, in other words, you're not playing this week in week 11, and you have, week 12 is your semifinal week. What you may want to do if you haven't done the move already because you're afraid of dropping a player that someone else will pick up to use against you, and they don't necessarily have a good matchup in week 12, I would say go ahead and drop him. Look tomorrow night. Start dropping guys off your roster tomorrow night. If you have a 24-hour rule with waivers, no one can claim that guy until next week anyway. They won't be able to use him for the weekend games, and it kind of keeps the integrity of the league going. Yeah, you do have to worry about the waiver pool next week, but you've got a jump start on players that other teams in your league do not have because they're fighting for their playoff lives this week. And you have the luxury of sitting back and cherry picking some of those golden plays next week, maybe some of those 1 week wonders. Maybe it's only one or two, and maybe you do not need those guys, but maybe you have the thought that maybe if I get them, they can't be used against me. And that's something to consider. A lot of questions coming in on defenses as well in week 12. Joe, I've got a bye. Looking ahead, give me some of the sneaky defenses. And you know what? I had so many of those emails come in that I thought that I would just address that really quickly on the show, because all of you guys that have been playing college fantasy football and everybody that knows and is familiar with college football knows that the SEC in week 12 is sort of like a JV game. And it's hard to drop an SEC defense once when you get into week 10 because those sweet matchups in week 12 are right around the corner. I mean, you've got Georgia playing UMass, Alabama playing the Citadel. Those defenses are going to be taken in your league. I don't know if a team like Auburn would be picked up, but that would be somebody I would be looking at in week 12 if they're on waivers this week, or if they're a free agent this week. They play Liberty at home. Kentucky plays Middle Tennessee in week 12. That's one to keep an eye on. Many of you guys have already scooped up Army, who plays Lafayette. They have Colgate next week. Colgate may score a few points here or there, but I think that's a good matchup considering everything else on the board. App State playing at home against Georgia State could be a nice addition if you're looking 1 week out. It's hard to advise anyone to take or recommend anyone to take a North Carolina defense, but they will be available, and they do have West Carolina next week. You'd have to consider your options there. A defense that could be there for the taking may be a South Carolina against a Chattanooga in week 12. I think that's a sneaky play that could. I know I picked them up this past week, just hoping that I would win my first playoff game, which I'm in this week, and have them for next week. Very fortunate for a lot of us guys in our in-house league that the guy that actually has Auburn versus Liberty, Georgia versus UMass, and Alabama versus the Citadel, I believe he's got them all on the same roster, did not even make the playoffs. So that actually is a good thing for many of the guys in our league. And then, LSU's probably taken. They play Rice at home. And then maybe, just maybe, a team like Old Dominion with a home matchup against Virginia Military, who only has one win all year. I still do not anticipate Old Dominion being able to shut anyone out. When you look at the Virginia military schedule, there's a lot of close games that they've played. There's a lot of games that they've scored into 20 and 30 points. Toledo, I believe, beat Virginia military at the beginning of the year 66-3. So there is some hope, but that would be sort of a sneaky play where if you're looking ahead, defenses to take, and that might be a Week 12 sneaky play for you in regards to the defenses. So with that, guys, we're just going to go ahead and jump right into the Week 11 slate, get started on this. I know there's a lot of games that have already played. There's one going on right now with Wake Forest and NC State, but we're going to start with tomorrow night's game. Louisville playing at Syracuse. And here we go, guys. So for me, I mean, obviously, I believe Louisville's a dumpster fire, right? I just can't see at this particular point. And this is what I'm going to mention on this show. There's a lot of teams right now in Week 11, as we get Week 11, Week 12, Week 13, where it's just like, man, there is too much on the line right now to take a chance on some of these guys that we just, or some of these teams that we just cannot get the pulse of, that we've missed, they've been inconsistent. I'm going to bring some of those out as we do the show. But for me, that's Louisville. We're staying away from Louisville this week. I think with Syracuse, you've got Dungy in there. You've got the receivers Riley, Johnson, and Custis, who you can take shots with as well. There's no guarantee, but I think Dungy is definitely the safest option. As a matter of fact, if you want to take a short-term punt on a guy this week, it would be Dante Strickland. That Louisville run defense is really bad. If there's a one-week nugget to come out of Syracuse this week, maybe it's running back Dante Strickland. Take a look at him if you guys need him. A late matchup Friday night, Fresno State playing at Boise State. I actually think this game's going to be a little bit more defensive than what we're used to seeing out of some of the Fresno State games. I'm a little concerned if you have Marcus McMaryion, how much you're actually going to get from him. Not because... And I think it's a combination of just the Boise State defense and playing on the road. So I think that's a real questionable call right there. I think Keyshawn Johnson remains a start. I think it's hard to bench wide receivers no matter the matchup, particularly this late in the season, unless they're playing an NFL team. On the Boise State side, I think Alexander Madison, look, he hasn't been a 100-yard machine all season long. So what you see is what you get. He's probably going to give you 60, 70 yards. He's got a chance to punch it in once, maybe twice. I think for me, the bigger concern is on the Boise State passing side. Fresno State has really been tremendous, exceptional against the pass. And now all of a sudden you've got Rippon, you've got to take a pass on this week. I do believe that at home. I think you look at a guy like Hightower, the wide receiver, who has a question mark, and I need to check some of these updates. The last time I checked the injury updates were last night. I do have some updates that I could pass along, that I've gotten passed along to me just within the last couple of hours. But last I saw, Hightower was actually questionable. And so now, between Hightower, Richardson, Modster, I just don't know how much out of the passing game Boise State's going to get. I really think that this is going to be a slugfest. I'll be interested if this game is not close Friday night at Boise State. TCU playing on the road at West Virginia. And I have to tell you, I'm a little... First of all, let's stick with what we know. Will Grier, David Sills are definitely a must start. Jalen Reagor for TCU is definitely a must start. It's hard for me to look at this matchup and say, Michael Collins for TCU, I've got to get him in there because he's got to keep up with West Virginia. I'm a little concerned. Road game at West Virginia, I don't think it's a slam dunk. I'll tell you who else isn't a slam dunk, and that's Greg Jennings, who's been very inconsistent this year. And when I say inconsistent, I mean, look, it wasn't until that game-tying touchdown last week that he actually put himself over 10 fantasy points. I think he only finished with 30-something yards and a touchdown, which really isn't that much. So I think Jennings now is really a wild card in this matchup. I think you really need to look at your roster. It's going to be it's going to be really hard for some of you guys to sit Jennings because I know he was a high pick, and he's probably on paper one of your better receivers on your roster. But I have to tell you, you really need to look at some of these matchups. But the fact that West Virginia is home does help him out. Michigan playing at home against Michigan State playing at home against Ohio State. And real interesting tidbit on Ohio State, and I think I mentioned this on last week's show. Coming out of the bye, it was interesting to see if Ohio State was going to change their identity coming out of that bye and then playing Nebraska last week. And we know that they squeaked by Nebraska, and it didn't surprise me. I think I even mentioned on the show that I wasn't even going to be surprised if Nebraska put a scare in them. But the one thing that did change, and I did read this, I did hear this as well, is that Ohio State has sort of scrapped the RPOs. And what, let me tell you what that does. To me, that brings a guy like J.K. Dobbins back into the fold. And that's what I was wondering. Was Ohio State going to get back to more running the ball, which I believe is what I said on the show last week, or are they going to fall into the trap and just air it out? And it looks like they got Dobbins more involved last week, and it wouldn't surprise me to see him be more involved again this week. Now, they are playing Michigan State, who has a really good run defense. The problem is Michigan State has been gouged a couple of times by some really good teams. So if teams, and I think it was Michigan and Penn State, that if teams like Michigan and Penn State could run the ball, I don't particularly look at Michigan State's defense now as a shutdown run defense. And I think Dobbins is an interesting play this weekend, but I think if you have Dwayne Haskins, you have to get him in your lineup, because the one thing that we do know is that if Ohio State can't run, they're definitely going to throw the ball. And if you get Haskins in there, all of a sudden now that brings Campbell, that brings Hill, that brings McLaurin back into the fold, but you have to evaluate your receivers depending on compared to what you have on your roster. And that's what I'll recommend for you guys. On the Michigan State side, you know what? It's just really tough. Connor Haywood with a good week last week, but can you really trust him with your playoffs on the line or moving forward? And I tell you, if you grabbed him off the waiver wire, even though Ohio State has been susceptible to the run, is this the week that you're really going to take a chance on a player from the Michigan State offense? You know, are you going to take a chance on a Cody White? For some of you guys in Power 5 leagues, I get it. You're going to have to. You've got your hands tied. But for you guys in full FBS leagues, I don't think those are plays this week. Central Florida playing at home against Navy, and I have to tell you, Zach Abey moving back to quarterback sounds really great. But I mentioned how much a mess this Navy offense was. And if there's a game where, I mean, look at what Temple did. Anthony Russo, the quarterback for Temple, did against Central Florida last week, had an unbelievable game. Is that the type of game that Zach Abey could give us for Navy against Central Florida this week? Possibly. He could do that. But here's the deal. What have we seen from Navy to make you think that you are going to put Zach Abey on the line for your playoff life this week? And that's my real concern. I think you've got to stay with Mackenzie Milton, right? I mean, look, the one thing that I'll warn fantasy owners as well, you had McCray last week with a breakout game for Central Florida. Just, you know, some emails coming in. Just because one guy has really big week doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to have it again the following week. And it's really hard to continuously start 1 week wonders at this particular point of the season when you have consistency on your bench. Here's what I'll tell you. Stay with the guys that got you there. Ride out with the consistency guys and put your fate in the hands of the quarterbacks that can get 30 and 40 points, of the running backs that can get 30, 40 points. You have Singletary, you have Mackenzie Milton, you have Kyler Murray. Those are the guys that you need to perform if you're going to win anyway, but you've got to give them help. And you can't take a chance in a 2-quarterback league of all of a sudden Zach Abey pulling out a goose egg because that Navy offense cannot get on track. Now, Gabriel Davis is supposed to return for Central Florida. I think he left the game last week in the first quarter, had 60 yards, I believe, in the first quarter and exited. So that was an early exit for his fantasy owners, but I believe he's back this week, and I would get him in if Davis is healthy. Florida playing at home against South Carolina, and looks like South Carolina's banged up at the running back spot. You know, I liked Rico Dowdle going in to last week's matchup against Ole Miss. He got injured very early in that game. It looks like Tyshawn Williams is actually injured as well. I'm a little fearful if you have Deebo Samuel, who pulled out a nice week last week for his fantasy owners just because he had a kick return touchdown. But other than that, I didn't really see much from him. Brian Edwards, to me, is the receiver that I want in this matchup on the South Carolina side. On the Florida side, it looks like we've got clarity at quarterback because Kyle Trask came down with an injury in practice. So it looks like Felipe Franks will remain the starting quarterback, but I don't know if you're playing him this week unless you're in a SEC-only league. I think as far as the Florida side goes, the only guy that I'm really considering, the only guy that I would even look at, and it would have to be in a flex spot in a full FBS league or in a Power 5 only league, would be running back LaMichael Pirine for Florida. Wisconsin playing on the road at Penn State. Jonathan Taylor, obviously back in the game. He scored last week. Just when I went on my rant about him not scoring, he scored. So you're welcome, Jonathan Taylor owners. Sometimes I just have a way of putting the good jinx and bad jinx on certain players, and look like it worked for Jonathan Taylor. As a matter of fact, I think Jonathan Taylor might have 3 200-yard, 3-touchdown games, and I think the only games he has scored, and I could be wrong, somebody can double check me, is the games he's actually scored 3 touchdowns in. Which is it's a very odd and very strange stat. I think if you've got Trace McSorley. Here's my thoughts on Trace McSorley. We all, he was on the bench list last week. We all mentioned that stat that I threw out, how he has not accounted for 2 or more touchdowns in what is now 5 consecutive games. If he is going to snap that streak, maybe it's this week. I have to tell you, this is where I think a lot of you guys have Trace McSorley, and if you don't have much behind him, maybe you have to ride him out. Maybe you have to put your fate in the guy that did it for you through the first half of the season and hope that he can pull it out now that he's 1 week past Michigan, hopefully a little bit healthier this week. That's a tough call to make, and it's something you have to evaluate, particularly if you're in a 1-quarterback league. And I think in a 2-quarterback league, you've got a little bit a larger margin of error. And I think you can take a chance on Trace McSorley this week. And I think it's taken of chances. McSorley and Miles Sanders, both last week had terrible matchups. I think this could be a week where you can entertain the possibility of getting both of those guys in your lineup with some sort of return. You just have to remember the ceiling probably isn't going to be as high, as it was if they were playing in Illinois, if they were playing at Purdue, if they were playing in Minnesota. So put things in perspective, weigh out your options on your roster, but I don't think that they're sits this week. Eastern Michigan playing home against Akron, and it looks like Cato Nelson is going to be out. I'm wondering if that makes the Eastern Michigan defense a sneaky play this week. Tyler Weigers has been solid, and I think he will be solid in this matchup if you need a long shot quarterback in a 2-quarterback full FBS league. And then speaking of long shots as well, I'll give you 2 more names from that matchup. Blake Banham, the wide receiver, and Shaq Van. And there's a name from the past. There's a name from the preseason last year. Shaq Van getting it going a little bit. It has a good matchup this week against Akron. If you need a player that maybe could churn out 80, 90 yards, possibly 100, and score a touchdown for you on the ground, and you're in dire straits at the running back position, you may want to take a look at Shaq Van this week playing at home against Akron. Tulsa playing on the road at Memphis, and I mentioned last week, and a lot of you guys on the email, that it looked like Darrell Henderson was going to be back. You got him in. Big rewards there, and really rewards if you have the running backs for Memphis all around. Patrick Taylor, Tony Pollard, all producing. Wide receiver DeMonte Coxey is now worked his way into, hey, I've got to give him serious consideration and starts this week. And it looks like he climbed our rankings this week as well. And that's a guy that you may want to consider getting in there. I'm still a little hesitant to get quarterback Brady White in there because they are so run heavy that when you've got Henderson and you've got Taylor and you've got Pollard, I just don't see where White's going to throw more than a couple of touchdowns. And so that's the chance that you take starting a Brady White. SMU playing on the road against UConn, and I have to tell you, this game is going to go a long way into deciding a lot of fantasy games this week. Last week I believe it was Liberty versus UMass. Was it Liberty versus UMass? This week, this SMU UConn game has fantasy potential written all over it. I think it makes Ben Hicks a must start. I think you've got Reggie Roberson and James Proche, who are now must starts. I think if you've got Braden West, or you've scooped him off the waiver wire, or if he's out there, you may take a shot with him, even if it means giving you 80, 90 yards and a touchdown. I think on the UConn side, it's David Pindell, and that's it. It's going to be a one-man show. I'm actually even a little concerned about David Pindell this year. I think SMU's defense can do something, can limit him, even though they're playing at UConn. But if you've got Hicks, you've got Roberson, and you have Proche, you've got to be very thankful for this matchup this week. Kansas playing on the road at Kansas State, and I have to tell you, I love Alex Barnes this week, but there is a disclaimer. It looks like Skylar Thompson may not play. It looks like he's banged up. If he does not play, if Alex Delton gets to start, all of a sudden now Alex Barnes becomes a nervous play for me, because now I'm worried about Alex Delton vulturing some of those touchdowns inside the 5-yard line, inside the 10. I have to tell you, I don't think Skylar Thompson's going to play. I'm hoping Skylar Thompson plays, but Alex Barnes' matchup on paper looks so good this week. I almost feel like you have to take a chance on starting this guy just in case he gives you one of those 150, 200-yard, 3-touchdown games. He could be a difference maker for you this week if you're in the playoffs or you're fighting for your playoff lives. I almost feel that he's the type of player where you actually throw your hat in the ring with him. BYU playing at UMass, and I have to tell you, 5 weeks ago, I would have been all over Squally Canada, and now I'm a little concerned to actually play anyone from that BYU offense, and they're playing at UMass, and that is a very odd thing to say. This is one of those things, this is one of those matchups where it's so good on paper, and now all of a sudden my worry is BYU throws out 6 running backs, and you don't know who's going to get the ball. BYU spreads it out, and in the stat sheet, at the end of the day, you look that they've got 4 guys that have caught 4 or fewer passes and 5 guys that have caught 2 or fewer. That's my concern with this game. Is Zach Wilson a play? I don't know. I'm really like I said, I'm nervous to put my chips all in on a Week 11 matchup when BYU has one of the best matchups on paper. Now, on the flip side, if you've got Andy Comas, the quarterback of UMass, after what he did last week, which I believe he accounted for 6 touchdowns, I don't think he's a must start against BYU. I'm actually a little nervous to start Comas this week, but I think if you have Andy Isabella, you have to get him in your lineup. And like I mentioned earlier in the show, you have a receiver at this particular point that's been a top 3 receiver all season long. You cannot sit him with your playoff lives on the line. And then I think Marquise Young is actually a questionable play. You've got to weigh it out. I'm a little concerned whether or not they'll be able to run the ball against BYU. And I said this last week because BYU played against Boise State. Some emails came in about some of the Boise State players, and in particular the quarterback. Sometimes I just don't know what BYU team is going to show up. Is it the BYU defense, that's going to give up 30 points? Or is it going to be the BYU defense that held Boise State to 21 and then went on the road and beat Wisconsin? And so it's Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. And I don't know which one we're going to get. Army playing at home against Lafayette. And here's a matchup where a lot of you guys, I know you're thinking, you know what? I really like this matchup on paper. I've got Hopkins or I have Darnell Woolfolk. Do I play them because I'm worried about them coming out of the game a little early? And yes, that is a legitimate concern. I actually tell you this. There are a lot of questions coming in about Hopkins and Woolfolk, and there's a lot of questions coming in about Bryce Perkins and Jordan Ellis and Olamide Zaccheaus. I actually think that you're okay with Virginia. I'm going to be I'll be surprised. I won't be shocked. But I'll be surprised if Virginia, if Perkins isn't in this game by the start of the 4th quarter. I don't think Liberty is that bad. On the flip side of it, I can see where Army kind of runs through Lafayette. I could be wrong, but I think that could happen. I think you've got a little bit more concern on that side. But, considering what you have on your roster, and you look at Hopkins and you look at Woolfolk, it almost looks like it's too easy for Hopkins to get 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. It almost seems too easy for Woolfolk to get 100 yards and a touchdown. And considering what you have on your roster, why not take the guy with the easiest matchup and take a chance there? Yeah, maybe he gives you 50 yards and a touchdown, but Woolfolk also has the potential to give you 102 or 3 touchdowns. So you have to consider the matchups. I get it. You compare it maybe, you have 2 quarterback leagues. I'm just telling you guys, I would much rather have my guys with an easier matchup. I would rather be debating Army against Lafayette, and I'd rather be debating Virginia and Liberty than to be debating McSorley and Miles Sanders playing Michigan. And think about that. Missouri playing at home against Vanderbilt, and right now Keyshawn Vaughn is really hot. I think if you have him at the running back spot, he's got to be in your lineup this week. The one guy that's kind of taken the back seat is Kalijah Lipscomb. He's really struggled through the middle of the season, through the second half of the season, I should say, after a really strong first half. It's almost like the passing game has completely they've gone from a predominantly passing team to a running team. That's what it looks like to me. At least they were passing it efficiently at the beginning of the year. Now they're running it efficiently at the end of the year. And I think that's a trend that will continue on the road at Missouri. Now, on the Missouri side, I think if you have Locke, you have to consider putting him in there. The thing about Locke that you're always taking a chance with is that, Demarie Crockett and Larry Roundtree, to me, have a lot of similarities from a fantasy standpoint as Sony Michel and Nick Chubb last year. It seems like each of those guys scores every single week. The only problem is they don't necessarily give the yards that Michel and Chubb churned out for Georgia last year. But Crockett and Roundtree are almost a slam dunk for 50 to 70 yards and a touchdown every week. It's like they're trying to keep both guys happy. I don't blame them. They're both solid, and their offense is really clicking right now. The good thing for Missouri is that Emmanuel Hall came back last week, and so if you held on to Emmanuel Hall, or if he's out there, you need to go get him. He needs to be in the lineup. I'm guessing that everybody still kept him, but if you kept him, this is a matchup just in time for the playoffs. He's come back for you, so you got to get him in the lineup this week. Ole Miss playing on the road at Texas A&M, and I have to tell you, I probably fielded a ton, or not a ton, but quite a few emails since the rankings came out late last week about Ole Miss quarterback Jordan Ta'amu being too low in the rankings, and I can see it. I can see that. I can make a case for Jordan Ta'amu being where he's at, and I can make a case for him being a little higher. I could. My concern is that I don't think Jordan Ta'amu is going to be able to give you anything on the ground. They played South Carolina last week. They're playing Texas A&M this week. They're playing at Texas A&M. Texas A&M, one of the better run defenses in college football. I'm concerned if you have Scotty Phillips, although it's hard to recommend benching him because I think he could still score and give you 60 to 70 yards. But I don't know what Jordan Ta'amu is going to give you other than passing the ball. And I'm not expecting a 50-50 shootout, a 42-40 shootout like they had with South Carolina last week. So I like Jordan Ta'amu. He's been solid all season long, but I have to pause a little bit, have a little hesitation in Jordan Ta'amu this week, putting him inside the top 20 quarterback rankings. And on the Texas A&M side, I think you really have to love Travion Williams. You're sitting on Travion Williams this week. You've been blessed with a good matchup, and the only thing that probably is going to hold you down at this particular point is some freak injury. I hope I'm not putting the jinx on you, but I think you have to feel pretty good if you've got Travion Williams, and I think if you have Jay Sternberger, the tight end, and I say his name every week, I think you have to feel good about him finding the end zone as well. Nebraska playing at home against Illinois, and I think at this particular point, Reggie Corbin should be in your lineup. But yeah, he's not going to get 20 carries. He's probably going to give you between 11 and 15 carries, but he has been efficient with his carries, and he's had some big games. And this Nebraska defense, even though Nebraska's offense is on a roll, the defense isn't exactly shut down. So I do think you take a shot with Reggie Corbin. I think A.J. Bush, the quarterback, is definitely a long shot play, but I wouldn't rule him out. Over on the Nebraska side, it's almost foolish at this particular point if you don't have Martinez, Ozigbo, Spielman, or Morgan in your lineups, and those four guys are all must-plays at home this week against Illinois. Maryland playing on the road at Indiana. I think the only two plays for me that I'm looking at would be Patrick Ramsey, the quarterback, Stevie Scott, the running back. I'm going to temper your enthusiasm a little bit. I don't necessarily think that's a fantasy gold matchup, but I do think the matchup being at home will definitely favor those two guys for Indiana if you need to get them in your lineup. North Carolina playing on the road at Duke. North Carolina's a team right now that just scares me. I don't even know what, I don't want to recommend a North Carolina player with your playoff lives on stake. But when we look at the Duke side, here's what I'll say. Deion Jackson has been super solid. And Deion Jackson, one of those guys, he's not going to give you 20 to 25 carries. But Deion Jackson, I believe, I could be wrong, I think he's scored maybe like 8 or 9 games, maybe all but 2 games this year. It's a good bet against that North Carolina defense, who isn't particularly good against the run, that he's going to find the end zone and find 100 yards for you. And I think you find a way to fit Deion Jackson, the running back for Duke, in your lineup this week. If you're really struggling at quarterback and you need to take a flyer on somebody, maybe this is the matchup. You get Daniel Jones in there. It's just Daniel Jones isn't producing any rushing touchdowns this year. Maybe this is the game. Who knows? Maybe this is the game you take a shot at where you play and you're an underdog. You need to kind of shoot for the moon against somebody. But I don't feel great about it. But if you need to make that play, he's at least an option for you. Troy playing on the road at Georgia Southern, and we know what happened to Appalachian State when they went into Georgia Southern a couple of weeks ago, which does make me a little bit nervous. But remember, Appalachian State, they lost some players. I think if B.J. Smith has been as solid as they've come for Troy, I think if you've got him, you've got to get him in your lineup. I think if you have Wesley Fields, the running back for Georgia Southern, I think he's a start as well. The only guy that's a little questionable for me is Shai Werts, the quarterback at Georgia Southern. I think you'd really have to kind of weigh out some options before you stick him in there in this tough conference matchup, and this game's going to go a long way in deciding the conference champion. UCLA playing on the road at Arizona State, and at this particular point, Joshua Kelly against any Pac-12 defense is schedule proof. He is a must start. Eno Benjamin, the running back for Arizona State, is a must start. And N'Keal Harry, absolute beast for Arizona State, he's a must start. If there's another player in this game, aside from Caleb Wilson, the tight end, who I would even consider, it would just be maybe Manny Wilkins, the quarterback for Arizona State. And it's only because he has Benjamin and Harry to throw the ball to. When you've got targets like that out of the backfield, you're good for a solid week if you need it in that home matchup against UCLA. Wilkins hasn't been a fantasy stud, but if you're struggling at the quarterback spot and maybe you're looking for just a safe 250 and 2 touchdowns, maybe 3, then Wilkins could be your guy in a home matchup against UCLA. And then Charlotte playing on the road at Marshall. And I'll say this, Bennie LeMay has been a solid running back for Charlotte all year. I'm a little nervous about him this week. And I think in regards to Marshall, a lot of questions coming in. I still don't have any information saying whether or not Tyler King is back. You have to assume that he's going to be out. It looks like Isaiah Green will resume the role as starting quarterback. I think that makes Tyree Brady a little bit more valuable now this week because they had a nice report in the earlier part of the year. And Bennie LeMay, as I mentioned, Bennie LeMay, I will say this. Bennie LeMay is on my bench list, and here's what I have on Bennie LeMay. He's rushed for at least 80 yards in 5 consecutive games and has 3 100-yard games this season. However, the Marshall defense is only allowing 103 rushing yards per game, and they have not allowed a 100-yard rusher all season long. And, I shouldn't say that. They have not allowed a 100 rusher through 8 games. Yeah, that's all season long. And the that stretch even included the game in which they kept Devin Singletary, the FAU running back, out of the end zone and snapped his 19-game running streak. So I think you are a scoring streak. I think you are taking a chance with Bennie LeMay by getting him in your roster this week. And one thing that I will say, I'll go back and press pause and rewind for a minute because I did have Deion Jackson on my start list, and I didn't stop to say that. And here's what I have on Deion Jackson. He's coming off back-to-back 100-yard rushing games. They were both on the road, and he has scored in 6 of the past 7 games. This week, Jackson and Duke get North Carolina at home. The Tar Heels are allowing 225 rushing yards per game, and that's why I say Deion Jackson is a start this week. So let me get back to the list, guys, with the games on what we have going here. And so that was my take on the Charlotte-Marshall game. We've got Liberty playing on the road at Virginia, and a lot of questions coming in there because people are worried about Perkins, people worried about Ellis, people worried about Zacchaeus, and whether or not how long they're going to play. Usually every once in a while I'll give you a gut feeling on what I think is a game. What kind of game, who's the player to look for in this game. This is I've used the example like this is a Bryce Love type game, a J.J. Arcega-Whiteside type of game. This, and I've said this before in the past, this reminds me of Olamide Zacchaeus type of game. To me, that's what this game has the makings of. I like Perkins and I like Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus has been a little inconsistent from time to time. But I actually think that Jordan Ellis, for me, is the guy that I'm really concerned about because this matchup looks so good on paper, but Ellis has actually laid some clunkers too. And I actually feel that there's more volatility at the receiver spot than there should be at running back spot. And it's hard for me to go all in, put my chips all in on a guy that has been inconsistent all year at the running back spot because at running back and the quarterback is really where you need consistency. The receivers is usually what kind of puts you over the top. I am a little concerned about Jordan Ellis, but I have to tell you, it's hard to look at this matchup and say, I can't get him in the lineup this week. And so if you have to, go ahead and get him in. For Liberty, I think if you have Antonio Gandy Golden, you get him in the lineup. I am a little concerned about Freddie Hickson. Frankie Boyd played last week as well. I'm concerned about the Liberty running game, but I think Liberty can do enough in the passing game to stay in the game long enough to keep Ellis, to keep Zacchaeus, and to keep Perkins in the game long enough for them to be tremendous fantasy contributors for you. Middle Tennessee playing on the road at UTEP, and Ty Lee right now is on a roll. At the beginning of the year, we talked about how many fantasy owners were probably really this close to dropping him, and I think now he has scored in 3 straight games. Another good matchup. I would expect that maybe he finds the end zone again and keeps it going. And Chatton Mobley, the freshman running back at Middle Tennessee, big game last week, but be careful. Be careful. Sometimes it's a death trap of picking up and starting a guy that's had one good week, particularly Middle Tennessee, who I think has had 58 different rushers at any time this year. So it just seems, I know it looks good on paper, but beware because you never know. Could be, Tavares Thomas gets in there, could be Terrell West. Last week it was Chatton Mobley. Be careful with that Middle Tennessee running back spot. Bowling Green playing on the road at Central Michigan, and with Bowling Green, I think Deggy is an option at quarterback. Andrew Clare right now is still a question mark for me, and I have concerns considering that he missed the last game on do you start Andrew Clare even if you hear that he's going to play or if he's suited up, because you take a chance of him turning that ankle and now all of a sudden he leaves the game after 2 or 3 carries and you're playing catch up from there on out and you're chasing points with the rest of your lineup. I think if you have Scott Miller, you go ahead and certainly get him in there. And I have to tell you, the most interesting play of the week, I think it's the most interesting play of the week in full FBS, is whether or not you fantasy owners who need a running back go get Romello Ross, the running back from Central Michigan. I'm telling you, for me, he is my wild card this week if you need a running back spot. Here it is. This is what I have on Romello Ross. I have him on the start list this week, playing at home against Bowling Green. Consider this. Of all the names included on our 2018 list this year, every week, this running back, Central Michigan running back Romello Ross, may be the biggest surprise on the list. Why should the fantasy owners reach for him this week? Quite simply, guys, it's the matchup. And I say this every week. Sometimes you got to be careful just playing the matchups. You got to play the guys that got you there. You have to have a confidence level. There's a lot that goes into these picks. But I'm telling you, if you need a guy, this is the one to get. He hasn't had, I think, more than 12 fantasy points in any one game this week. But Bowling Green has the nation's second worst run defense. They're giving up 320 rushing yards per game. Bowling Green have allowed a 100-yard rusher in 8 consecutive games, and they've allowed a total of 10 100-yard rushers this week. And if anyone from Central Michigan is going to keep that streak going, it's going to be Romello Ross, running back Central Michigan, playing Bowling Green, and he is my biggest Week 11 wild card. If you need a running back and he's on the waiver wire, Scoop them up. Heck, scoop them up before your opponents can get them, because if they listen to this show, they're going to go get them. Matter of fact, get off the show and go pick them up right now. Come back in 5 minutes. I'll be on. I promise. I'll only be probably one more game into this. Okay, guys, next matchup on there. Mississippi State playing at Alabama. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of defense in that game. I don't like Fitzgerald in that game. I don't really like anything from the Mississippi State offense. It's hard to say that I don't like anyone from the Alabama offense. Alabama's at home. Alabama scored, was it 29 points against LSU last week. But Mississippi State's defense isn't bad. Mississippi State's defense can keep them in the game. I just don't see it. I think if you've got Tua Tagovailoa, I think if you have Jerry Jeudy and you've got Henry Ruggs and Irv Smith, I think this is just a regular week. I think you got to start them. You've got to get them in the game again. And I think those are must plays as well. As a matter of fact, we'll go back to the bench list because I have Nick Fitzgerald, quarterback, Mississippi State, on there. So let's revisit it. Nick Fitzgerald has accounted for 8 touchdowns in the past 2 weeks. So he's on a roll. He's coming off back-to-back 200-yard passing games. First time he's done that all season long. However, Alabama is only allowing 102 yards per game on the ground. So that does kind of neutralize Fitzgerald on the ground. And they've also given up the fewest rushing touchdowns in all of college football. They've only given up 3 rushing touchdowns all year. And if your league plays minus points, takes into account minus points for interceptions, also keep in mind, for as many garbage touchdown scores as Alabama has given up, they've actually got more interceptions, 13, than touchdown passes they've allowed this year with 12. And for me, Nick Fitzgerald on the road at Alabama, unfortunately for a lot of you fantasy owners, is a Week 11 bench. And if you have Nick Fitzgerald, you really just need to get through this week, because what's coming up in the next 2 weeks is really why you have Nick Fitzgerald. So it's all about surviving this week, getting into Week 12, and then that sweet matchup against Ole Miss in Week 13 as well. Michigan playing on the road at Rutgers. This is all about Karan Higdon. That's all it is for me. I think Shea Patterson at quarterback has actually been pretty decent from a fantasy standpoint. If you're in a league that, you're looking for 2 touchdowns and 250 yards, this is a matchup that'll give it to you. But other than that, he's not going to, his ceiling is not going to be 350 and 4 touchdowns. Oklahoma State playing at Oklahoma, and I think this game is definitely going to go a long way in deciding a lot of fantasy matchups. I have to tell you, a lot of fantasy owners from Marquise Brown kind of frowning upon Marquise Brown right now. Little bit of a slump. Very disappointing performance from CeeDee Lamb last week. I think he needs to get back on track. If you've got Trey Sermon, obviously you've stolen one, and now it's all about consistency. It's hard to sit Trey Sermon now if you have him after his 3 touchdown performance last week. And then Kyler Murray's going to do Kyler Murray, so you know that you're good there. The guy that's interesting for me in a full FBS league, even Power 5 league, that's been efficient is Lee Morris, wide receiver, Oklahoma. I think he's got like 16 receptions. 8 of them have resulted for touchdowns. He's almost boom or bust, but when it seems like he's not going to keep that up, he goes ahead. He goes ahead and scores another touchdown or 2. So that would be a wild card flex spot for you guys that are just in a pinch, and maybe he finds the end zone once or twice for you. Over on the Oklahoma State side, I think you've got to start Justice Hill. I think you've got Tylan Wallace, and then you've got Cornelius as well, the quarterback. I think those 3 guys you have to get in there are going to have to score points to keep up with Oklahoma. If you have those 3, you get them in your lineup as well. Kentucky playing on the road at Tennessee, and for me, this is all about Benny Snell. Maybe a long shot on Lynn Bowden if you're playing in a Power 5 league, maybe full FBS if you need a long shot player, just because maybe he can give you a little bit in the kick return as well if he can make one big play for you. But I don't see much more from a consistent standpoint out of this game than Benny Snell. Washington State playing on the road at Colorado. I still don't have an update on Laviska Shenault. You are looking at an owner of KD Nixon last week, and as soon as he scored that touchdown, I've never been more depressed about a touchdown because I knew he was out of the game the minute I saw him grabbing his hip. Looks like he's out. If you need a Colorado receiver, because they're going to have to keep up with Washington State, I think if you have Trevon McMillan, you almost have to play him now because there's not many options on the Colorado side. I think from a wide receiver standpoint, maybe Winfrey. He looked to be the best option last week. if Nixon and Chenault are not back, then Winfrey for me all of a sudden becomes an option at receiver. On the Washington State side, too, it's kind of hard to get away from Gardner Minshew for sure on the road at Colorado. They're going to score points. I think you've got Williams, you've got Borgie. I think they need to be considered. And then the wide receivers as well, whether you have Patman, whether you have Winston, whether you have Martin. It's a little bit of a roll of the dice, but one of them are going to hit. And at this particular point in the season, I mentioned the volatility at wide receiver. There's not a lot of elite receivers that are putting up consistent numbers. There are just very few John Ursuas, Laviska Shenaults when he's healthy, and Andy Isabellas. I mean, when you get past the receivers and Preston Williams, when you get past the first top 5 or 7 receivers this year, everybody, even the guy that you're playing, is going to have some volatility at the wide receiver spot. So don't be afraid to take a chance on some of these guys that can go for 150 and a touchdown for you. Northwestern playing on the road at Iowa. This matchup really just concerns me all around. Everybody in this matchup, with the exception of the Iowa tight ends, Hawkinson and Font, everyone else in this game makes me nervous. If you've got Sargent, I don't think you could feel comfortable. You've got Kelly Martin. I don't know how you feel comfortable putting him in. If you have Bowser, he's going to get 18 to 22 carries probably, but is he going to find the end zone? I don't think you can feel comfortable with him. Flynn Nagel has done hardly anything recently. You can't feel comfortable with him. Clayton Thorson, Nate Stanley. I don't know how you feel comfortable starting anybody in this matchup besides the tight ends from Iowa, and that's my take on that game. Baylor playing on the road at Iowa State. And I have to tell you, I was expecting a huge game from Montgomery last week. Hakeem Butler turned in a couple of nice plays, really big catch. I think you have to get Butler in again. I think you have to get Purdy in again. I think you have to get Montgomery in again. I think the one player for me that I'm nervous about this week, and I actually started him in our total points league last week, was Jalen Hurd, because he's going to give you some carries out of the backfield, and he seems to be their best receiver. But I have to tell you, I really did sweat out a touchdown into the fourth quarter last week with Jalen Hurd, and I'm worried that fantasy owners of Jalen Hurd are going to be doing that again. But like I mentioned, if anything, Jalen Hurd at least has been consistent. He's not going to blow the roof off, but at least he's given you consistent and steady numbers every week, and that's sort of what you're looking for at the wide receiver spot. But if I didn't say I was nervous because in this matchup, because it's a road game at Iowa State, I'd be lying to you. But the Iowa State players need to be in your lineup. North Texas playing on the road at Old Dominion, and I think for 3 players for North Texas, you've got all 3 of them. You find a way to get them in, particularly DeAndre Torrey, the running back, Rico Bussey, the receiver. If you have both of those guys, they are must starts this week. Mason Fine, I think, is a start, but consider what you have on your bench first and compare before you go ahead and just assume and get them in there. I think Keyshawn Strong is a viable option. Old Dominion running back playing at home. I don't think this is going to be an easy matchup for Old Dominion, but the fact that they are at home does help. If you need some support in the run game, Keyshawn Strong may be able to give it to you this week. And I think you actually have to look at Fulham. You actually have to look at Duhart as options as receivers as they try to keep up with North Texas. Duhart was the receiver to have in the first half of the year. Fulham's the receiver to have in the second half of the year. And I think if you have Travis Fulham, you go ahead and get him in the lineup this week against North Texas. New Mexico playing on the road at Air Force, and for me, it's all about getting Isaiah Sanders into your roster. Virginia Tech playing on the road at Pitt. Interesting matchup. I don't know what Pitt team's going to show up. Is it going to be the one that limited Notre Dame to 19 points, or it's the one that's going to give up 40-something points to Duke? That's an interesting matchup. And so if you have Ryan Willis now, you're debating on, do I go ahead and, because Ryan Willis has been really steady, but to say that Ryan Willis is, I can't say he's a bench. I have to say, if you have Willis and what he's given you up until this point, you've got to get him in your roster. but I am a little worried about that matchup. I think if you have Hazleton, the receiver, you get him in there. I think Quadri Allison, if you have him, you're playing in a Power 5 league, it's hard not to start him. Yes, Darren Hall did explode last week, I think for 3 touchdowns, but I think Allison has been consistent enough that he's going to continue to get the carries. And let's be honest, they rode Hall last week. He was the hot hand. That's going to happen sometimes in these systems with 2 running backs, but I see it playing out exactly the way it has for most of the year with Pitt, where Allison probably gets 12 to 15 carries, Hall gets probably 9 to 12, and then they'll kind of play it from there to see who has the hot hand. Minnesota playing at home against Purdue. I think if you have Rondell Moore, you're questioning whether or not he's actually 100% healthy after last week. Big game by Terry Wright. Hard to just go ahead and throw Terry Wright in the lineup this week. You've got other contributors with Purdue like Isaac Zico. I'm a little nervous for DJ Knox. I did have some questions coming in on emails today. It looks like he's a little banged up. We've got to check the injury report for him before we go ahead and throw him in. But I do think it's a good matchup for David Blah. Over on the Minnesota side, I think if you have Tyler Johnson, the wide receiver for Minnesota, he's definitely a must-start this week. I think if you have Mahim Ibrahim, he's going to be a must-start as long as he plays. I mean, whether or not he's continued to be banged up, I don't know. But if he doesn't play, all of a sudden now with Shannon Brooks out, Bryce Williams, remember Bryce Williams from the beginning of the year, he comes back into the fold. But with Bryce Williams, the one thing that you have to remember too is when we saw Seth Green taking those short yardage touchdowns. So if Ibrahim is out, I don't know if you necessarily just jump on Bryce Williams because my concern is maybe he's going to give you 80 to 100 yards, but will Seth Green get the touchdowns? My feeling is I think Ibrahim plays. I think you owners are going to be okay. It looks like Zach Annexstad will return at quarterback this week. And then Rashad Bateman as well has been a big play receiver recently for Minnesota. And I could see where this game becomes a little high scoring and maybe all of those guys that I just mentioned do become viable options for you this week in Week 11. Utah State playing at home against San Jose State. I think Jordan Love, we need to check the injury report on him. I had received some notes that he was a little banged up. I think Darwin Thompson has been really solid at the running back spot. It's hard not to start him. If you want to say they're starting San Jose State and you want to take a shot with Gerald Bright, I get it. I understand that. There's a lot of you guys that can get Gerald Bright at the wide receiver spot in Fantrax. So that wouldn't be a bad shot right there in a good matchup against San Jose State. And then the only person that becomes a question for me, if Jordan Love is questionable, is wide receiver Ronquavian Tarver, who actually has been hot recently over the last few games. But if Love for some reason becomes a question mark, all of a sudden for me, Tarver becomes a question mark as well. Texas State playing at home, hosting Appalachian State. Looks like Zach Thomas will make his return this week. And I think if you have Darrington Evans, you have to get him in the lineup at this particular time of the year. Even if Marcus Williams looks like he is going to take some carries away from Evans, I think there's enough for both of those guys to get enough carries against Texas State. And I think both of them can be productive for you. Western Kentucky playing on the road at Florida Atlantic, and let's make no bones about it, this is the Devin Singletary game. Tulane hosting East Carolina, and I have to tell you, this is one matchup where you look at Tulane and you say, it's all about Darius Bradwell and Corey Dauphine. That's going to be the two-headed monster for Tulane. You need a running back that can get you 80 yards and a touchdown. Both of those guys are likely to do that. Tulane's pass defense is not that good. So I can see Holton Ahlers having a good game in the air. I can see Trevon Brown having a good game in the air. But I am a little concerned. I am a little concerned about East Carolina going on the road. That Tulane defense can stiffen up. I'm worried about how many points can be scored in this game. And I did get a couple of emails thinking that Ahlers was a little too low in the rankings. And here's what I said. It's just a gut feeling of mine. It's my rankings. Sometimes I like to go with my intuition on this. It's sort of a scenario where you play it out when, for instance, Oklahoma Army at the beginning of the year. You have a team like East Carolina that plays up tempo, puts the ball in the air a lot, and all of a sudden Holton Ahlers comes out and he's not particularly that accurate. And for the first half of the game, first quarter and a half, they go 2 and out, they go 3 and out, maybe three times, and you put the balls in the hand of that Tulane offense, and they start grounding out first downs, and they start chewing up the clock, and it just shortens the game. So the reason why I'm worried about the East Carolina, the Ailers in this game and why he's not higher is that I just feel that Tulane at home has the ability to shorten this game and limit the amount of possessions that East Carolina will get. We'll see if it plays out like that. I could be completely wrong, but that is what my intuition is telling me, and that's why Holton Ahlers isn't as high in the rankings as some of you might assume that he would be. But I have to tell you, if you have him, keep your fingers crossed, because I believe next weekend is the matchup against Connecticut, and that's the one where you're going to want him in your lineup. Florida, let's see. Coastal Carolina playing at home against Arkansas State, and obviously if you've got Justice Hansen, he's going to be in your lineup this week. And I think you have to take a look at Justin McInnis and Kirk Merrick, the wide receivers at Arkansas State as well. Coastal Carolina, you're considering maybe Marcus Outlow, maybe Torrance Marable, the running backs. Maybe you take a shot with Williams, the wide receiver. I actually think he could be a sneaky play at the wide receiver position in your full FBS leagues, because there's no doubt Coastal Carolina they're going to have to keep up with Arkansas State this week. Louisiana Raging Cajuns playing at home against Georgia State. It looks like Dan Ellington, I threw his name out last week. Looks like he was banged up. Looks like he came out of the game. He's a question mark this week. But I have to tell you, another name that I like for Georgia State this week, if you are not familiar with Trey Barnett, the running back of Georgia State, and you need a running back, and you looked into Romello Ross already, and he's gone, and maybe you're looking at Trey Barnett, maybe you need another running back, go look at him. Georgia State's going to score some points against Louisiana Lafayette. And I'm telling you right now, Trey Barnett is not a bad name to own this week in a playoff week. And I think if you're an owner of Trey Regis and Elijah Mitchell, you get him in the lineup this week against Georgia State as well. There's definitely enough balls to go around in this type of matchup. South Alabama playing at home against UL Monroe. Caleb Evans and Marcus Green, for me, are definitely starts. I think you have to consider Derek Gore as well, for as bad as the South Alabama run defense has been. And on the South Alabama side, I know we've mentioned Kawan Baker for a lot of the year. I'm really worried about the amount of touches that Baker's going to get. But somebody like Trey Minter, the running back for South Alabama, I don't think he's going to necessarily be one of those guys that could give you an 150 and 2 touchdown game. But if you're looking for a guy to give you 60, 80 yards and a touchdown on the ground, you may want to take a look at Trey Minter as well, South Alabama running back at home against UL Monroe. Utah playing at home against Oregon. And I think at this particular point, if you've got Oregon players, you can't be really nervous about Justin Herbert right now. You can't be really nervous about, I think Dylan Mitchell's got to be in your lineup. I think CJ Verdell, maybe, but here's the deal. We just found out, I just found out not long ago before I came on air that Utah is without now Zach Moss. Looks like he's going to be out for the rest of the year, at least rest of the regular season. They already lost Tyler Huntley. So if you're watching this show, first of all, and you haven't found out about the Zach Moss news or heard about the Zach Moss news, get off the show right now, go on your phone, pull it out, and go get Armand Shine, the running back for Utah. He's most likely going to be the #1 running back taking over for Zach Moss. So you're excused for the next 5 minutes to go pick up Armand Shine off the waiver wire in your league. If in case the other owners in your league do not know about Zach Moss, and come on back. We'll be 2 games in by the time you get back. But that news is devastating for Utah. Tyler Huntley out, Zach Moss is out, and now you have to wonder how efficient Utah can be on offense. You have to wonder if that limits the effectiveness of their defense in giving the ball back to Oregon, and eventually maybe that Oregon offense wears them down, because playing at Utah is not an easy place to play. All things considered, if Huntley and Moss were healthy, there's no way I'd be picking Oregon to go into Utah to win this game. But this matchup's got completely flipped on its head now with those injuries to the 2 biggest fantasy contributors in that Utah offense. Georgia playing at home against Auburn, and I have to tell you, I was touting Jatavius Whitlow at the beginning of the year. He picked up steam. He had a few good games. This is not a matchup you want to get him in, particularly after last week's matchup. But DeAndre Swift right now is on a roll. He's a guy that you want to get in there, and that Georgia offense looks like it's finding itself a little bit, and DeAndre Swift is definitely a must start this week. Georgia Tech playing at home against Miami. I think right now I have been staying away and recommending staying away from Miami offensive players. I think if there's a player you may want to target this week, it would be DJ Dallas. And I say DJ Dallas because Travis Homer has been banged up. And if Travis Homer is banged up and Lorenzo Lingard is already out for the year, then DJ Dallas is going to get most of the carries. Doesn't matter who's going to start at quarterback now, whether it's Perry or whether it's Rozier. If Travis Homer is out, for me, DJ Dallas becomes a start. And on the Georgia Tech side, I don't think we're going to see Taquan Marshall again, at least in the starting role. I think it's Tobias Oliver's job, and I think that's the way that I see it shaken out. If you want to take a shot on a guy like Jordan Mason, I think you can. But for me, it's all about Tobias Oliver, quarterback Georgia Tech, and I think he needs to get consideration to start this week, even against Miami, because remember what Boston College did to Miami just a couple of weeks ago. Florida International playing at UTSA. I mentioned this last week. I'll say it again. James Morgan did keep his streak of throwing at least 2 touchdown passes. He's done it now in 8 straight games. It's at least consistency in you guys in full FBS leagues that require two quarterbacks. Rice playing on the road at Louisiana Tech, and I think you need to consider Jacquizz Dancy. I think this is going to be, if you have Teddy Veal, and you've been waiting for Teddy Veal, who has been playing really well recently, I think this could be a really big game for Teddy Veal. I am a little nervous to take out and say just pick up Jamar Smith because of this matchup with Rice, but I do think this could be a good matchup for Jacquizz Dancy, and I do think if you have Teddy Veal, he's a must-start this week for Louisiana Tech. Houston playing at home against Temple, and I think De'Aaron King and Marquez Stevenson, for me, are the must-starts on Houston. I'm really scared, particularly after last week with Houston offense, but those are the 2 guys that I definitely want to own. When I look at the Temple side, I want to look at Anthony Russo. We know what Houston has given up in the passing game this year, and so I think now all of a sudden Anthony Russo, after seeing what he did against Central Florida last week, he becomes a viable option. If Russo is an option, you have to look at Ventel Bryant. You have to look at Isaiah Wright. And a lot also depends on whether or not Raquel Armstead is going to go into this matchup healthy. And that's a really big if. Because I have to tell you, if Raquel Armstead is good to go, you've got to get him in this matchup, which figures to have a lot of points scored in it. But he's one of those players that I think there's 2 players this week that I'm really nervous about starting that I think have good matchups. Raquel Armstead, and we're going to get to one coming up in a few minutes, and that's Bryce Love with Stanford, who is obviously still battling the ankle injury, but they play Oregon State this weekend. So let's just tackle the game while we're there. I said halfway through the year that you just wanted Bryce Love to be healthy for the stretch run, and now we're in the stretch run, and Stanford's got Oregon State. And I have to tell you, after seeing the carries that Love got last week, if you're sitting on Bryce Love, it's hard not to start him against, or if we find out that Bryce Love is definitely playing against Oregon State, knowing how bad that Oregon State's defense is, here's my thing. You drafted Bryce Love early at the beginning of the year. He hasn't done particularly well for you. You have built your roster up to this point around Bryce Love, despite what Bryce Love has or has not done up until this year. How great would it be to finally have him come through for you? I think you have to ride Bryce Love out in this matchup if you know he's going to play. It's simply too good on paper, and it's just sitting there. 200 yards and 3 touchdowns for the taking if he's healthy enough to get 16 to 20 carries in this game. Let's see how that plays out. But if I'm sitting on Bryce Love, I have to tell you, I'm on the edge of my seat on the start this week because I have a feeling if he stays in that game, he could potentially get 200 yards this weekend. South Florida playing on the road at Cincinnati. Not a good matchup for South Florida at all. It's South Florida in the running game. That Cincinnati defense has been solid. They've been stout, and now all of a sudden, fantasy owners that had Jordan Cronkrite, who tied a school record. Matter of fact, Jordan Cronkrite is on my bench list this week, so let's just get right to Jordan Cronkrite if I actually have the paperwork on him. But yeah, here it is, guys. Jordan Cronkrite, 3 weeks ago, he tied the school record for most consecutive 100-yard rushing games. But he's been their second best fantasy back over the last 3 weeks, playing second fiddle to Johnny Ford. So not only is he competing carries with Ford, but Cincinnati's only allowing 105 rushing yards per game. And there's only 2 defenses in the FBS that have allowed fewer rushing touchdowns than Cincinnati. So for me, that spells disaster if you're sitting on Jordan Cronkrite, hoping that all of a sudden now he's going to get 15 to 20 carries over Johnny Ford, and they're playing on the road, and they're playing a team that's only allowing 105 yards per game, and they're playing a team that doesn't allow many teams in the end zone on the ground. I have to tell you, Jordan Cronkrite, week 11 bench this week, unfortunately, if you have him. If you've got Cincinnati, I tell you, you've got to be feeling really good, too, about Desmond Ridder, and particularly Michael Warren this week. I think Michael Warren has a big game for Cincinnati. Here we come down the stretch, guys. Not many games left, but Florida State playing on the road at Notre Dame. I already had my notes written with Ian Book. That obviously changes the complexity of the entire fantasy matchup of this game. I think since that news came out, not only did we take Book out of the rankings, but I dropped Miles Boykin down in the rankings as well. I think Book is extremely important for Boykin. I think now that Brandon Wimbush is back in the lineup, I think you'll see a more run-centric Notre Dame team. I don't think that will be a problem. The problem becomes the problem comes in if Book's not back for the Syracuse game. That'll be interesting to see because it looks like Notre Dame will have to score some points. Now, here's an interesting thing for me. Book not being back, I think, actually helps Dexter Williams because now the read option comes a little bit into play, and that Florida State defense has actually been strong against the run. If Florida State can be had, it's against the pass, but now you introduce Dexter Williams and Brandon Wimbush, and maybe now the run game has a little bit more oomph for Notre Dame. And so I think this could help out Dexter Williams owners, where I was actually expecting Dexter Williams to have a tough go at it earlier in the game, and Ian Book and Miles Boykin hooking up. It looks like, and I have to tell you, Notre Dame's run game better get going because it'll be really interesting to see what will happen if it doesn't, and Wimbush has to throw the ball. But for me, from a fantasy perspective, I think if you have Dexter Williams, you've got to get him in the lineup. And I'm staying away from everybody else. I still think Miles Boykin is an option for Notre Dame. I just don't feel comfortable knowing that I don't know what to expect out of Brandon Wimbush at this stage in his career. On the Florida State side, obviously we know the running back problems. They haven't had a 100-yard rusher all season long. I don't think anything's going to change against the Notre Dame defense. If they're going to do anything against Notre Dame, they're going to throw the ball. That puts Naquan Murray and Tamorrion Terry into play, but I just don't feel good. I don't even know what's going on with quarterback with Florida State, which is a soap opera in itself. And if you haven't seen anything, it's been up whether it's going to be Blackman or is it going to be Francois. Francois already came out and said that the coach told him that he's the starter, but Blackman's a great backup and he's ready to go. And the coach is saying he hasn't even made a decision yet. So that's a real interesting soap opera going on with Florida State. I'm actually following that more than anything else right now. LSU playing on the road at Arkansas, and I think if you have Nick Brossette, you have Clyde Edwards-Helaire. This is 2 good plays for them. On the Arkansas side, I think if you have O'Grady, the tight end, I think you've got to give him a go. I mean, he's not going to be going against those tough DBs against LSU. Maybe they match him up on a linebacker or a safety, and maybe he's the guy that comes through for you. Rakeem Boyd, yeah, he's at home. I think he's going to get some touches. I think he'll get some yards. Can he find the end zone? Possibly. But I hate if you have better matchups on your roster. I just don't like you. I don't want you guys to be sweating out a touchdown into the fourth quarter when if Arkansas's only got maybe 13 points, 14 points, and you're sweating out some extra points from Rakeem Boyd. It's always hard to sweat those points out from running backs if they're playing behind late in those games. Texas playing on the road at Texas Tech, another game with a lot of fantasy potential. Sam Ehlinger, Jet Duffy, the quarterbacks, I think, are both in play. Lil Jordan Humphrey, Colin Johnson, wide receivers, both need to be in the lineups. I think if you've got Antoine Wesley, he's definitely a must play. I think Vasher, at this particular stage in the game, after knowing that he had a touchdown last week, Wesley is definitely the number one wide receiver. Duffy is definitely going to target Wesley more often, but I think you do take a chance on Vasher in this matchup as well. Southern Mississippi playing on the road at UAB. I think Kez Watkins for Southern Miss is a play. Spencer Brown is the obvious play for UAB, who could be without quarterback A.J. Early, and that could mean a heavier dose of Spencer Brown this weekend at home against Southern Miss. Clemson playing on the road at Boston College. I believe A.J. Dillon is going to play. I bet they wish it was Corey Dillon too, although A.J. Dillon, I'll take A.J. Dillon every day of the week over Corey Dillon. A.J. Dillon is a beast. Whether or not A.J. Dillon is going to be able to get going in this game is really what the question is going to be. Here's the deal for me. Here's what I think is going to unfold. I think A.J. Dillon is still, as long as he's healthy, long as he doesn't get nicked up again, he's going to get 20, 22, maybe 25 carries in this game. I don't see how I can see where A.J. Dillon's going to top 100-yard mark. I can see that. If he averages 4 yards a carry and gets the ball 25 times, there's his 100 yards, boom. He only has to break one. He's going to get his 100 yards. The question for me becomes the scoring part. I just don't see where Boston College is going to be able to score a lot of points on Clemson. So that's, for me, here's the question. Can you live with A.J. Dillon if he gives you 120 yards and no touchdowns? 12 fantasy points, he's not going to give you anything out of the backfield, most likely. And if he doesn't find the end zone, can you live with 120, 125 yards from A.J. Dillon? And for me, and here's my take, if you've got A.J. Dillon and you've got a guy on your bench who you feel is the equivalent to his fantasy output this week, then you stay with A.J. Dillon. Because A.J. Dillon's the guy that potentially could give you 180 yards and 3 touchdowns. And I know that's very unlikely to happen against Clemson, but you never know. And I'm riding a guy that's going to get the ball 20, 25 times out every day of the week. On the Clemson side of it, Trevor Lawrence has been solid as they come. Obviously, he's not the super fantasy quarterback, but I think if you have Travis Etienne and you have T. Higgins, those for me are the two best plays in this game, two best fantasy plays. Oregon State playing on the road at Stanford, and I think for me with Stanford, I touched on this earlier. It becomes about, this is all about the health of Bryce Love. And if he is healthy, this is the game where Bryce Love will carry you into the next round. Maybe you've struggled with Bryce Love all season long, and this is the one game, if he's healthy enough, watch him not play now that I'm saying this. This is the one game where he can make up for everything he hasn't given you all season long and carry you into the playoffs or the next round of the playoffs. The interesting thing for me with Stanford is that I do not think J.J. Arcega-Whiteside is going to play. And tight end Caden Smith has been playing as a number one receiver recently. So if you guys are going in there checking the waiver wire and you're going in receiver and you're not required to have a tight end in your league, but you can play a tight end at receiver, I'm telling you right now, if you're overlooking Caden Smith, you're making a mistake. I picked up Caden Smith in my league, and I'm not even required to play a tight end. He actually will become the de facto number one receiver if J.J. Arcega-Whiteside doesn't play. That's my opinion on him. I think if Caden Smith is available, you get him in. He's probably taken in leagues that require tight ends, but if they don't, go take a look at him as well. I think on the Oregon State side, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Artavis Pierce has been banged up. I don't know if Jefferson's going to be able to get going in this game. This is one of those coin flip games where he's been so good for so long. Do you roll the dice with him this week against Stanford? I actually think Stanford could be had a little bit in the passing game. I think Hodgins, and Bradford actually become options, especially in PPR leagues. Oregon State more than likely is going to be playing from behind. And if they can, I think they can do a little bit and move the ball in the passing game. I just don't know how often they're going to be able to find the end zone at Stanford. Cal playing on the road at USC. and Cedric Ware. You kind of saw that game coming last week, matchup against Oregon State. But here's what I'll tell you: he's been inconsistent this week for fantasy owners. That Ware has done good one week, he'll come back the next week, not so good. Good week, not so good. And I have to tell you, this Cal defense is really good. They're not great, but they're solid enough to limit a team like USC, who's been very inconsistent all season long. And now I don't think they're going to have Michael Pittman back this week. I'm not sure yet. I'll have to check on that. But I'm really worried about the inconsistencies of putting my playoff fate, in the hands of a USC running back when Ware has been predominantly their best back all year. But you never know who's going to lead the team in rushing. And now all of a sudden, they've got a tougher matchup. They go from Oregon State to Cal. Big difference. And if you have Patrick Laird, it's hard to get away from Laird right now because he's going to get touches. UNLV playing on the road at San Diego State. Colorado State playing at Nevada. Let me mention that game first. Colorado State, Preston Williams at the top of our wide receiver rankings. They've had a week off. I think this is a big week for him, particularly in PPR games, playing on the road at Nevada. I think Nevada will move the ball as well. I think Ty Ganji could be given consideration to start. I think Tua, the running back, this is a good matchup for him against Colorado State. And I think you kind of need to weigh your options with Izzy Matthews. I don't think this is a great matchup for him, but some of you guys in deep FBS leagues, maybe he's worth getting in your lineup, but I'm not particularly sure. I'm a little nervous about that, but I do want to get back to the UNLV at San Diego State game because there's two notes that I have, one on the start bench and one just a personal opinion about Juwan Washington. First of all, Lexington Thomas, for me, is a Week 11 bench, and everybody knows that has Lexington Thomas, that UNLV has lost 6 consecutive games, and during that stretch, Lexington Thomas only has one 100-yard rushing game during that current losing streak. Well, this week, he faces the 4th-ranked rushing defense in the FBS. San Diego State are only allowing 83.1 rushing yards per game. And for me, that makes Lexington Thomas a Week 11 bench at San Diego State, who now has Juwan Washington back. And I have to tell you, perfect timing for a lot of you guys. I said last week that we weren't sure how much he was going to play, but you just wanted to see him get in. You wanted him to perform, and you wanted to get him bumped up a little bit and get him ready for the playoff run. Well, I think he even found the end zone twice. And the playoff runs here. Juwan Washington is healthy, and you've got a really great matchup. So guys out there with Juwan Washington, I think this is now the moment where he's going to carry you this week. Guys that have been sitting on Bryce Love, and guys, I kind of get pumped up for some of this stuff because all season long I've been saying, look, yeah, Bryce Love's been hurt. This is where you really need him. And I'm not even a Bryce Love owner. But for the sake of what I do here on the show, for the sake of what we do for the site, for as much as you guys follow us, for as much as you guys kind of throw your hat in the rings with us, I'm pulling for all you owners that have Juwan Washington, that have Bryce Love. We have talked about at the beginning of the year how tough of a season it's been between injuries, weather cancellations, injuries again. It has been a tough season for many of you guys, but you've scratched, you've clawed, and you're still here watching on the show. So I tell you guys, and I know I'm coming to the end of the show before you guys start hopping off, and I'm going to get the questions that are into the thread. I want to thank everyone that comes on this show and watches every week, whether you watch it live or whether you watch it in a replay. And that's look, I got a busy life too. Most of the stuff I watch is on replay. I cannot thank you guys enough for not only supporting me, supporting the CFF site, the collegefantasyfootballsite.com, now in 8 years of existence, and we're only getting better. We're only getting bigger. And look, guys, you guys, I say this every year, you're the best support group in all of fantasy sports. The college fantasy football community is unlike anything that I have ever seen. I experience it firsthand. And so a deep, heartfelt thank you to all of you guys that have followed us all season long. And I'm going to go ahead and get to some of the questions. And look, guys, I'm going to do some of these shows. I'm going to try to do some of the shows during the bowl season, leading up to the bowl season as well. If you're on live now, or you're actually watching the show on replay, and you have not subscribed to the channel, or you have subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. Also, click that little bell. You'll be alerted when I go on live. If I happen to do an impromptu show and you want to catch it live and you got time, hit that little bell and it will alert you when I go on live. I just hope that I have all the questions here, because I know a lot of them came in. Walt, looked like you took some of yours back. Deion Jackson, Ross Woolfolk, or Gabriel Davis at flex. And I have to tell you, I'm going to rule out, because all of these guys, in my opinion, Walt, some of them look like they're right around the same tier. I have to take out a Davis because he left with an injury last week, so I am worried about that. I'm assuming you mean Justin Ross for Clemson. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. Which for me, it comes down to Woolfolk or Deion Jackson. And I tell you, if you have any concern about whether or not Woolfolk will exit that game early, Deion Jackson is your guy, and that's my call this week out of those four. Dylan Mitchell or Rondale Moore. This comes in from Mike. Dylan Mitchell or Rondale Moore. Worried about Moore's health? Same here. My other wide receivers are Trevon Brown, money. A.J. Brown, solid. And A.J. Richardson on my bench. My other receivers are Trevon Brown and A.J. Brown with A.J. Richardson on my bench. I think that's the play. Well, Mike, I think that's the smart play. Trevon Brown, A.J. Brown, and I think, and here's what I say, and I say this every week too. You've got to consider who you're playing as well. A lot of this comes to, do you need the guy with the high ceiling, or do you need the guy with the high floor? In my opinion, if that's the case, you take Dylan Mitchell. You play it safe. You're not worried about Rondale Moore's injury if you take him out of the equation, because Dylan Mitchell still has a nice floor compared to Rondale Moore as well. And for me, from a safety standpoint, maybe it's Mitchell, maybe it's Brown and A.J. Brown this week. Armand Shine, DeAndre Torrey, Rico Bussey, Dexter Williams, Tylan Wallace, non-PPR. Got 2 flex to fill out of those guys. Wow, good for you. I have to tell you, I have a lot of faith in Rico Bussey. I know it's non-PPR, but I'm telling you, he's the #1 receiver in that North Texas offense, playing on the road against Old Dominion. The only way that I would shy away from him, Jonathan, is actually if there were some bad weather rolling in. Check out the radar there. I'm a little hesitant to jump on Armand Shine in week 1, being that Tyler Huntley is out as well. I'm a little more nervous with that matchup, considering you've got Dexter Williams and Tylan Wallace right there on your bench. I think Shine's almost a hold and wait and see when you have players like that. I am a little concerned about the Dexter Williams, the change in quarterback. And so those factors come into play. And so for those 2 reasons, I know it's non-PPR, but I can see, I like Bussey and I like Wallace from a yardage standpoint. And I get that it's a non-PPR, but I would rather 2 guys that I think are slam dunks for 100 yards than guys that are not. Robert, thanks for the compliment. Really appreciate it. Did I miss any potential week ahead defenses to pick up for week 12 and 13 in Power 5 leagues? Thanks in advance. Adam, I did touch on that at the beginning of the show. You might want to, after this show is over, you might want to go back, fast forward it maybe about 3-5 minutes into the show, and I did touch on a few defenses in week 12. So that's it, guys. I want to thank everybody for coming on in. It's playoff time. I hope you guys stay around throughout the playoffs, even if it's just some information on the matchups. But look, good luck to everybody playing this week. I hope everything that I gave you helped you in some of the decisions that you had to make this week. And if there's there's still a lot to be determined. There's still a lot of injury news out there. And if any of you guys continue to have any lineup questions moving forward, you have the exclusive email. Shoot me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can, guys. Thanks for another great week. Good luck this weekend, and I'll talk to you soon.